Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, airing live Monday nights on kgraradio.com and now as a podcast on iTunes and wherever else you can find it. You can learn more at my member site, richarddolanmembers.com. Now, join me for a fascinating exploration of all the things you secretly want to talk about, from UFOs to government shenanigans, strange science, future tech, and more. Here on KGRA Radio, welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. It's September 10th, 2018. Happy to be here with you tonight. It's been about 25 years now that I have been throwing myself into the subject of UFOs. Nothing could have surprised me more than to think at the outset that all these years later I'd still be fully devoted to it. There have been some ups and downs, for sure, and a few moments when I would say I truly wondered if I wanted to continue studying it for the long haul, but for me at least, it's a subject I can't leave. I mean, I've seen this over and over again with myself, and recently I've been so deeply involved in it that I just find it more and more fascinating all the time. I've found that as the mystery deepens, so do the rewards of delving into it. The main reward for me is the feeling of total engagement with the world. There's a lot about UFOs I still don't know, but I know for sure that it's something real, it's something extraordinary, and something important. That's a case, for me, that's open and shut. And knowing this fact, or these facts, have forced me to reevaluate over the years, it's forced me to reevaluate my entire base of knowledge, I would say. All of the things that I thought I knew, I was suddenly in a position of freshly reevaluating everything that I thought I'd already settled in my mind. In other words, my engagement with the UFO subject has helped me to wake up in a very serious and a very profound manner. Tonight's guest is someone who will definitely contribute to waking us all up. For the past few months, I've been interviewing UFO researchers from around the world, just trying to get a better sense of what's going on beyond the confines of American ufology. I've had guests from Britain, Germany, China/Hong Kong, Tasmania, and next door to me up in Canada. Right now I'm working on Brazil and Russia, but for tonight I have a real treat for you. And this is one of the most prolific and highly regarded researchers in Australia. Her name is Moira McGhee. I have 3 of Moira's books, and not only are they some of the best books you'll ever find on Australian UFOs, but they are some of the best books on UFOs, period. Moira's got that perfect combination, in my opinion, of being a tireless researcher with an analytical mind who is brave enough to research some really strange cases. And plus, her writing is just a joy. She's such a wonderful writer. There really aren't many people out there who can do all of those things, but Moira is one of them. Many of the cases that she's written about have included, she's got a lot of UFO sightings that are very dramatic and surprising to me that they're not all that well known outside of Australia. She's got quite a few cases also that deal with very, very bizarre encounters with beings. Beings that look perfectly human but do not seem human, I guess we could say, not at all. And you can listen and decide for yourself. I've personally been increasingly interested in some of these cases as well. Before I bring Moira on, I just want to remind you that if you want to follow what I'm doing, you can go to my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where I delve into UFOs, geopolitics, false flags, all in the form of video, audio, and blog posts. Also, see my traditional site of richarddolanpress.com, where I've got books written by myself and many other fascinating authors. Definitely find me on my YouTube channel, which is very active these days, and includes my live stream show, Intelligent Disclosure. My show tomorrow, which is September 11th, will deal with 17 years of the effects of lies of 9/11 on our society and how destructive that has been. But that's for tomorrow. Of course, you can always continue to find me here at KGRA Radio every week doing this show, The Richard Dolan Show. So without any further waiting, let me bring on my guest, a fascinating pre-recorded conversation with Australian UFO researcher Moira McGhee. Welcome, Moira McGhee, to the Richard Dolan Show on KGRA. How are you?
Very good, and thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you on here, and I just want listeners to know that we have met several times. Our initial time, I think, was in late 2016. It was my first visit to Australia, and it was funny because I think among the Sydney UFO researchers, I think you're top researcher, and everyone said you must meet Moira McGhee. And I was
That's very flattering, but there are some other very good researchers in Sydney as well.
Oh, absolutely, there are. And I'm not here I didn't mean to demean anyone else. But it is true. Everyone was insistent that we meet, and I was so glad that we did. I discovered
And
you.
actually, we met. You came up to where I live in the Blue Mountains behind Sydney, which is such a beautiful area. And I think you did enjoy that trip as well, didn't you?
I absolutely did. It's very lovely. And then we met a second time, a little more recently. I was with my wife, Tracy, just a few months ago in 2018 here.
Yes, that's right.
Very, very nice. And I think, in American researchers, I don't know how familiar they are with Australian UFO research in general. And I simply want people to know you've written a number of books on the subject. I have 3 of them, and you may have others for all I know, but they are really excellent books. And the thing that I feel people should know about your work in particular is that, A, you've dove into this field for a long time now. You really know a great deal. But also your writing tends to be very analytical and brave at the same time. I feel like you delve into some very unusual cases, but you do it very methodically, and your writing's really great. I think actually it's very easy to follow what you write case by case and your ideas. So in fact, I think really, I think serious students of the UFO subject would benefit. Let me put it that way, by becoming more familiar with your work. So there's your free promo. How about that?
Thank you. Well, the thing is that I actually studied law at university, so I do tend to be analytical. I also think that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I don't come to any conclusions with my research because I don't know the answers. I know all the questions. I don't know the answers. And I don't think the reader really wants to hear a whole lot of theories that may or may not be correct. So I write the facts as they are. If it's a contentious case, then I usually put both sides of the argument, and I leave the reader to find out or make up for their own minds what the answers are.
Yes, I love that. It's something that I like to do on a good day, and so I'm glad that there are other people who are very much like that. I wonder if we can talk about your general assessment of the UFO phenomenon. Like, what is it that drove you to this field, and what do you, just in general, think that we're dealing with in terms of UFOs? And then from there, maybe we can get into some specific cases you've researched.
Well, I've always had an interest in astronomy, and since I was a small child, I've always looked up at the sky and thought, who's up there, what's up there? From a small age, I was taught that each little star in the sky could be a whole galaxy full of billions of suns and trillions of planets, and we really just don't know what's up there. Is there intelligence? I think there must be. And it was actually, I belonged to the Royal Society of Scientists and noticed one day that there was a UFO meeting another night. And I went along to the meeting and quite frankly got hooked. And that was when I was very young in the 70s. So I've been studying the phenomena ever since. And I can't say that I really do understand fully, because for every answer I get, another 20 questions popped up. But I think the UFOs, I personally believe, yes, some are our own technology, perhaps advanced, that we're not aware of.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly misidentifications and optical illusions, but there's a very solid core of evidence that there is something up there that is far more intelligent than what we are, and certainly far more technologically advanced. Insofar as interaction with possible alien beings, yes, that interests me greatly. I keep watching the reports from all around the world. and the conspiracy theories, some of which may or may not be true. I don't fully know the answers. However, it has struck me that just over 100 years ago, the Wright brothers were trying to get a flimsy little plane off the ground, and now we're going to the stars. Where did we get that technology from? Possibly technology which is going to be our downfall one day, and I might talk about that later. But it's a very, very puzzling situation, and I think once you start investigating it, you really just can't let it go because you're still looking for the answers.
I found exactly the same thing. I fell into the UFO subject, I guess, about 25 years ago, and honestly, I had no idea that I would be spending the rest of my life investigating it, and I suspect you might have gotten the same reaction.
And it takes you down so many different roads: history, science, sort of religion, psychology. I'm still trying to get my head around quantum physics, but I think that plays a very big part in it as well.
It's a great teacher. The UFO subject is a great teacher for all of these, shall we say, like leading edge or cutting edge types of areas of knowledge. And I think a lot of people who don't study the UFO phenomenon don't have an appreciation of just how extraordinary this subject is and how many roads it can lead you down. It's been a great teacher for me.
There's always more to learn.
Yes, most definitely. I noticed.
I do suspect the ufologist that tells me they know all the answers and they know everything because we don't.
Oh my God, I completely agree with you. In fact, when I run into a researcher or just anyone who acts as though they know what the answer is, I become a lot less interested because I've had more than enough experience with those people, and I just don't think that anyone's really got a 100% handle on this. This is a very complex subject.
I think maybe it's a psychological reaction in some people. Either they try to tie it back to their own religion, or it is sort of so perplexing that they arrive at a conclusion themselves. And that bothers me because some researchers then will make the cases in the investigation fit their own theory rather than trying to keep an open mind and keep it on a level playing field.
It's not simply investigators. I find a number of skeptics do the exact same thing rather than have a true skepticism, which means you are evidence-based. You want to see evidence for a hypothesis, which is completely reasonable. But some of them, I think, hold to their skepticism as a kind of religion, this idea that this can never be true, so therefore everything must be debunked. So I think that we see it in a lot of facets of this phenomenon. I wonder if I could ask you, I've been reading just lately, Tracy and I have been diving into your book, The Alien Gene. The subtitle of this is really interesting. It's called Interactions Between Humanity and Visitors to Planet Earth. This is a fairly recent book, Moira. When did you publish this?
Yes, I only completed it last year.
Yeah, June 9th, 2017.
Although it's a recent book, it's about 30 to 40 years of research, sometimes dealing with particular families, generations of the one family, for up to 20 years or longer.
Well, it's a great book. I highly recommend it. And I guess I would just... I'm not all the way through. I've really cracked about maybe a third of the way through, but I'm reading it carefully, I must say to you. And you have a lot of cases of these beings that look exactly human.
Yes.
Yes. I will just say, when I first began delving into this subject a quarter of a century ago, I will admit I had a very strong bias against those types of encounters of people who claimed to meet beings who looked exactly human. And it made me think of some of the 1950s contactee cases, which I put very little credence in, particularly at that time. My opinions are evolving, I guess I will just say, and to some extent. So it took me a long time before I started looking more carefully at some of these cases. But I have to say, you put together a very large number of contact cases of people with extraordinary beings that look human but certainly do not see human. And the thing that turned me around on this a number of years ago was the fact that I got my own few cases of people who would describe these things to me, and after a while, I just got too many of them myself, and I thought there's something going on here. So, going through the cases that you collected really, really got my attention, and I suspect that's. I think you have a lot of interests in this field, but I get the feeling that is definitely one of your interests. Is that? Would that be fair to say?
It is. It is. I'd dearly love to know the answers for that, and I don't. But there was just too many cases, and I actually personally knew 4 or 5 people that were acquainted with Adamski. Most of those people have passed on now.
George Adamski, yes.
One colleague who met him when he was a young lad, also a researcher. But in those days, it was public policy to discredit these cases. It caused too many problems for the government, security, the military. There was a Cold War with Russia. I honestly believe, too, I'm not sure who the Nazis were in contact with, but I have yet to speak to a witness whose father was in the Nazi military and working on reverse engineering a flying saucer. Maybe the one that crashed in Italy, I'm not sure, in northern Italy. But the thing is that after the war, Second World War, the main prize was the Nazi scientists and their advanced knowledge. Yeah. Where did they get that advanced knowledge from? And of course, that was the foundation of our space exploration. And there was always the worry, I think, with both the Americans and Russians of how many scientists and what knowledge the opposite side had got. And it really didn't suit them, for people to be seeing humans or humans who claim to be alien at that particular time. So I can understand the government's reluctance to accept these reports and to discredit them instead.
Yeah, I would think so. One of the things that you pointed out somewhere in the alien gene, and I cannot remember exactly where, but this conclusion that I think it was the U.S. or maybe the Australian military, but one of them concluded that, look, the most dangerous of all of these would be completely human extraterrestrials. They're the most difficult to deal with because it is impossible to know who is who. Or it can be very
even
difficult.
A problem today where I don't think the governments of the world are very enthusiastic about this line of research is because you do have some very disturbed people out there. Mm-hmm. And I've had a few very paranoid people ring me up and tell me that their neighbours were aliens. This is a problem that evolves out of this situation.
Oh my God! Can you imagine if the truth, let's say a disclosure of the UFO phenomenon were made, and one of the facts that came out, if it were to come out eventually, is that some of these beings look like us. You can just imagine some of the craziness and the panic that would take place.
That's right. Yep, right. And I mean, I was actually a disaster mitigator coordinator in my career, and one of the main rules is thou shalt not panic the public.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes, and that still goes today.
Well,
but on the other hand, these cases were too prominent. I at least had to investigate them on an impartial manner. Some of the witnesses, just a few, actually a minority, felt that it might be interdimensional or an optical illusion, that they could change their looks. But this is something that I haven't sort of had evidence of either way.
Well, maybe we can discuss it if we have time. But I do know, like in preparation for this interview, you were kind enough to send me some interesting suggestions for us to discuss, and I think that these are great suggestions. And I think it might just be a good idea to maybe walk our way through some of these. A few of them, by the way, are really early cases. You've delved into some like 1920s cases.
Yes, well, I could start with one in 1924. The gentleman approached me naturally in his dotage about it, but his name, all my witnesses, or just about all of them, I have given a pseudonym to for their own protection. But a gentleman called Ian Rogers lived in Coolman in West New South Wales, and it was a farming family, and they were fairly poor.
Yes.
And his mother used to send him out to check the rabbit traps because rabbits form part of the evening stew. And he went into the forest and suddenly saw a 30-foot-long cylindrical sort of craft with 4 square windows. And he hid in the bushes and he watched, and some people got out
Now,
and walked around for a while.
Moira, how old was he at this time? He had to be a child, or?
He was only about 7 or 8.
7 or 8, yeah.
That age.
Okay.
He was fairly young. He
Sorry
might have
to
been a
interrupt.
little bit older, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was still a young boy, and he hid in the bushes and watched. He said they just looked like normal people. They got out and walked around, seemed to be taking samples of something, eventually got back in the craft and took off. He said he was watching for about an hour, and then he went over to the landing spot to find that the ground was burned, the trees were singed, and there was a lot of dead birds around. And he found a piece of metal, and he said it was his piece of magic metal. Unfortunately, it's long gone, but he said sort of when he bended it, it would move and flexible and go back into shape. When he got home, his mother was really angry and said he'd been away far too long, longer than the hour he recalled. So
Yes.
whether anything else happened is something we don't know. Then we have a very interesting case in 1929. Now, the lady I'll call Belinda Davidson,
Yes.
she worked in animal rescue with me, and I noticed that she lived in a bushy, a leafy suburb of Sydney, but she would never go out at night without her dog. And I said, why? It's a safe suburb. Why will you not go out without the dog? And she said, you'll believe me about this, but nobody else will. And she was a highly intelligent woman. When she was a girl guide, about 12, she was suffering from incurable cancer. Now, her father had been a medic in the First World War, and he'd taken his little girl to every specialist in Sydney, and there was nothing they could do for their mate's little daughter. She was allowed to stay off school and used to go down to his piggery at Dolan Caves every day.
I see.
And suddenly, when she was 15, the doctors discovered the cancer was gone. She said that it wasn't just in remission. She said, I was coming home from a guides meeting one night and a flying saucer appeared above me. And she said these normal people, just normal people, took me on board and they said they cured me, but I must tell nobody. Now, unfortunately, just after she told me about this, she did come down with bowel cancer, from which she was cured, luckily due to our surgeons. But I then decided I would tell nobody about her mysterious cure by human-looking aliens until after she passed away. But I have another interesting case that I'm investigating at the moment.
It's
and
fascinating.
This gentleman is
Well, I want to hear the story, but what's interesting to me is like you collect these stories. These are from people that you personally know, and I'm sure
I
like
personally know this lady, and then it is because they've known me for so long, they start to trust me.
Exactly. You have an opportunity really to assess them in your way. So I think that gives these stories extra power, like when you're developing them firsthand.
It's a really interesting case. The gentleman is on his deathbed at the moment, and he's dying from something entirely different. He was a Native American Indian, and when he was about 9, he was very, very ill and dying, and the tribe left him beneath a tree. And he said, after a while, he's not sure how long, of sitting under the tree, a human-looking person came up and said, come with me. And this is an astounding story. He was taken on board a spaceship, and he said he was taken to a base on Mars. And he said there was different kinds of aliens there, including human-looking ones in some kind of a military uniform that welcomed him, made him feel safe, and they cured him of his ailment and put him back beneath the tree where he later joined his tribe. Now, this isn't just a one-off. This affects his entire family. There are other members of the family that have had experiences, which I'll probably go into in another publication because I am still researching it. But this was a second case, and certainly very interesting that he was told he was on a base on Mars, but I'm not so sure that's where he really was. But it's just an interesting aside to that.
Now, when did that particular event happen?
That would have been in the 30s.
So again,
Not
a
much,
very
not
long,
much
long time ago.
before the Second World War.
Yeah,
Yes.
these are all
And remember,
early cases.
what we had even at the beginning of the Second World War wasn't that advanced.
No, God, no, absolutely not. Um, it's amazing when we hear all of these claims these days about bases on Mars and such, many of which I have personally been very publicly, let's say, skeptical about. But then we keep coming again and again to these types of claims. Like, what do we do with them?
I honestly
right?
think that it's not our base on Mars, but I would not be surprised if an alien culture had a base on Mars. I'm wondering if, and it's a big if there are intelligent beings out there, perhaps the solar system is a sort of a far-flung military post that's important somehow in the scheme of things,
Yes.
and they possibly could be bases on Mars or a moon on Jupiter or something like that.
Well, I think
really
why not?
Don't relate to us, but
Yeah.
relate to their network and their structure.
Why not? If they're able to appear at will here on Earth, it wouldn't surprise me in the least that they would be able to have a secure facility somewhere near us in other parts of the solar system. I can only imagine that that could be possible. I don't really know.
The first really provable case happened on the 31st of August 1954, and I did know this gentleman who's just recently passed away, Seamus O'Farrell, who we call Jim.
Well,
He was 25 years.
Before we go there, Moira, I'm just thinking believe it or not, we are at the bottom of the hour. We've actually gone that quickly. I love hearing your story, your research, by the way. But let's take a very quick break, and when we come back, we will continue with this. I want people to know I'm speaking with Moira McGhee, who lives in New South Wales. Moira has been a long-standing UFO investigator in Australia and internationally. And Moira, what is the website where people can encounter your books or learn more about you?
Yes, www.independentnetUFOresearchers.com.au or just .com.
I'm going to make a link to that, so that people can go to it. But and this has all of your books and more information about you, and I think people really would want to go there. But let's take a very quick break. I'm Richard Dolan here with Moira McGhee on KGRA Radio. We will be right back. We're back. I'm Richard Dolan here with Moira McGhee on KGRA. Moira, so you were just getting into what you described as a highly provable case from 1954. We would love to hear about it.
Yes, on the 31st of August, Jim O'Farrell was a 25-year-old naval pilot from the Nowra base south of Sydney. And at dusk he went out for some training on his Sea Fury. He was flying at 12,000 foot when suddenly he saw two dark cigar-shaped objects pacing him on either side. Now, they were picked up by radar, and the radar operator said, will you do a circular manoeuvre for us to ID which craft you are? So he did a 360-degree manoeuvre, and they identified him, but they couldn't identify the two craft on either side of his plane. Now, for about 10 minutes, they paced him, and then they sped off at approximately 1,000 miles per hour. Now, this is something we just didn't have in those days. And the craft were also seen by witnesses further into the country. And I managed through devious means to get hold of a copy of the logbook for that night. And the duty officer had said, Superman, Superboy, Michael with his archangels, you make up your own minds.
No kidding. Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And there's another very interesting case that actually IUFOPRA, the Irish group, found out about, and that was in 1970, the British Railways Board filed a patent number 1310990, for a space vehicle. The gentleman that filed it on their behalf was Charles Frederick, filed in December 1970, and this was for a space vehicle. Now, that sort of gives rise to a lot of speculation. Why were the British Railways patenting a space vehicle that was very advanced with exotic propulsion? obviously I'd say probably the government was behind it, but it was very, very strange indeed that this would happen in 1970. The fact that they were patenting it sort of indicates to me that we didn't have anything that advanced in the years before, and there had to be some reason for them patenting it. But I give my thanks to the Irish researchers for having unearthed this, and I do have a copy of it, a copy of the patent in Contact Down Under.
That's interesting. So,
it is.
Yeah, like why would the British Railway Office, you said? From 1970?
Well, that's right. I mean, weren't they going to build the channel where they're going to ferry everyone across the across the water over to across the channel to France by a space vehicle? I'm not sure.
That's rather new to me. Yeah, very interesting. And
Maybe
if someone's listening, they can...
Because I actually come from Britain, I was with some of the British groups and in contact with a lot of those researchers for many years, and a lot of that research, which is more on a worldwide basis, is in alien gene.
Right.
Yes, so it's fascinating because Australia is a country of migrants, so there's people from all over the world that have come to Australia and have a lot of information about their own home countries. But I might go on to the fireballs. Now, this is interesting. On the front of Contact Down Under, I've got a photograph of one of these fireballs, which are really interesting. But that goes back to a newspaper report from 1904 in South Australia. Sub-Inspector Claude was on a sort of a mission thing with some Aboriginals. It was the 13th of February, 11 o'clock at night, and the Aboriginals came running into his tent, very frightened, took him outside, and he could see two very large balls of fire high in the sky, and they hovered overhead for 15 minutes. The natives then told him, they were from the Cooper tribe, they told him that in approximately 1879, natives from their tribes had seen these objects before. So this was quite fascinating. And then on the 15th of October in, I think it was about 94, I think, it was a Saturday night, Tom Price in the middle of West Australia. It's a small township just slightly inland.
Yes.
It was a hot Saturday night. They were having a barbecue. They assure me that there was no alcohol because the person hadn't arrived with a carton of beer. And a huge round shape of orange flame came slowly from the mountains, went overhead, disappeared to the south, and then another fireball came across. The next day, a whole lot of unidentified investigators came to the town and actually interviewed the witnesses outside of town, which was unusual. Then I got a report that another witness from south of Tom Price also saw the same objects. Now, there was quite a few photographs and videos taken of these two objects.
And Moira, what year or what time period was this?
It was 1994.
Okay.
It was interesting because quite a few people had videos of it and films of it. The film that was sent to a rather notorious laboratory I won't name all came back with those frames blank. But the one witness was flown down to Perth to go on the major news show with the photographs of this strange object. He was suddenly told by the TV company that they pulled the story and they flew him back with his video back to Tom Price. So the whole thing was hushed up.
Just so they know, Perth is a long flight from every other part of Australia.
They were even advertising earlier on the radio and the TV that they were going to show this footage, and it was suddenly shut down. Now, there was a gentleman called Harry Mason that was making claims that it was an advanced electromagnetic weapons system. I'll leave that one to people to that was being tested. I'll leave people to make their own minds up on that. But there was other sightings to start off with. Round Tregear in Sydney, and a colleague in Britain showed me photographs of the same object over, I think it was Wessex. Now, there's no way that the government would be testing brand new super-duper weapons over built-up areas. But the most interesting one was a colleague received a call from a lady who was on a bus at the same time, and it was in the country. They'll travel hundreds of miles to have friendly football games, and they've been to a football game with the neighbouring town, and a lot of merriment had existed afterwards, so most of the football players were quite drunk and rowdy. They were driving round on the road to go back home, and this huge similar object was landed at the side of the road, and like other witnesses, they described it as being very large, very wide, about 4 stories high. And all of a sudden the football players are screaming to the bus driver, "Get us out of here, get us out of here." She doesn't recall a lot more, except they're back on the road and everyone is dead silent. And she said that dead silence continued when they got home. Her boyfriend and none of his colleagues would talk about it. And I did have a little giggle to myself, as if it was aliens, what were they going to do with a busload of drunken footy players?
No, exactly. So, did you get an opportunity to speak with this bus driver?
No, I didn't. It's very hard to track people down in a place as big as Australia.
When did that particular...
No, and because the boyfriend wouldn't talk about it, sometimes we just let sleeping dogs lie. I mean, in this kind of research, it's the same like doctors say, first do no harm.
No, for sure. And that case took place, is this also during the 90s or some other period?
Yeah, 1994, about the same time as the sightings at Tom Price.
Yeah, it was a real weird, very, very much of a wave going on here. Is this...
That particular time, yes, and I did have some analysis done on the photos, which is quite detailed in Contact Down Under.
Is this related to, because you wread a book called the Gosford Files, and this took place...
Yes, that was a separate thing.
Yeah.
Gosford itself is a 50-mile long strip north of Sydney. It's comprised of lakes and beaches with mountains and hills behind, sheltering it. And there is a lot of reports. I've spoken to a lot of very elderly people there that recall even back in the 30s and 40s, they noticed energy lines, ley lines, earth grids, things like that. So the Aboriginals also feel that there are earth energies going in what the British call ley lines up the coast there.
There was a big wave of sightings. There was a lot of unusual activity in the Gosford area that you wrote about that took place also in the 1990s.
And there's something else very interesting that I'll just go into quickly before what happened in 1995-96. There had been reports of UFOs, little minor flaps in the 1980s and early 90s. And there was one very unusual case in 1988 when these typically ochre Aussie blokes were fishing off the bridge at a place called Woi Woi, and they could heard this weird screaming from underneath the bridge. So they got a torch and went down, and the screaming stopped, and later on it started again, and they went back down, and in the rocks they found a creature, small, with a big head and black eyes. I asked, "What did you do?" They said, "We were so frightened we just ran away." But they said later when they saw information on aliens, it was just like one of the little aliens with the big head and the black eyes. And I said, "Are you sure it wasn't a seal or something?" They said, "Oh, no way." But what interested me is a lot of reports of the smaller little grey aliens is that they don't show any emotion, but obviously this one was very, very distressed. I wish they hadn't run away because we could have got a lot of information out of that one.
Oh, my gosh. Well,
there's another place that's very interesting behind the Gosford. There's a cleft in the escarpment. It's hidden from view from below or above. It's 15 foot high, 5 foot apart between the rocks and 30 foot long. And the walls are covered with hieroglyphs. The Aboriginals said they've always known about them and it's someone else's sacred place. They even claim they were descended from the people who carved these hieroglyphs. First of all, the government tried to say that uni students had done it, but then I spoke to a couple of the uni students and they said all they'd done is cleaned out the lichen from these carvings so they could get a better view, which of course wrecked the carbon dating.
I've seen these. These are the Karyong hieroglyphs?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, I want you to talk about it, but I'll just want people to know. You gave me a video, I believe it had to be of these, the first time that I met you.
Yes, possibly I did, yes.
Yeah, it's like maybe 10 minutes long or so, I think, and These
Yes,
are
but
these are
yes.
quite
But then
interesting.
the, the government said some demented old codger had done it, which a geologist colleague said wasn't possible.
Hmm.
I found that the first evidence of them being discovered was in 1911. They were translated into early 3rd to 4th dynasty archaic glyphs dating back to about 2700 BC.
Okay. Wow.
So the other interesting thing is one of my colleagues had been with the British Army in Egypt, and he pointed out that there was a cartouche of an unknown royal whose the existence was only discovered in 1995. There are some very interesting energies around these glyphs, and I won't go into it now, but I think it's sort of part of the location of them, and I think a lot more work has to be done about it. But I do know that the Museum of Antiquities in Cairo and the Royal Museum in London are aware of them and have asked us not to let the government destroy them.
I will just point. I'll point out to listeners if they hear Moira saying 2700 BC and think that's impossible, that's too old. I will just remind people that Australian artwork goes back a lot longer than that. I was fortunate to be able to see some of the Aboriginal cave art that exists in some parts of that country, and was told, I mean, in many cases, some of this cave art is 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 or more years old. It's just mind-boggling to people who have not been there. The the people who have lived in Australia have been there. I think the estimate is 60,000 years or more. So
I think the Aboriginals claim more. That's another contentious issue.
Oh,
I
learned
about evolution and previous civilizations.
Exactly.
Anyway, I'll go into what happened at Gosford.
Please.
On the 30th, there was a couple of odd incidents and noises described in late December of 1995. And then on the Saturday evening of the 30th of December, all hell broke loose. The police received 35 calls, and most of the policemen actually witnessed these events. There was motorists, householders, all ringing up about a strange object over the lake, Brisbane waters. Dogs were either cowering in the corner or barking, and it was a shiny, silver, saucer-shaped object, large, about 30 metres across, 5 metres up from the water. It had a low humming, there was a brilliant light, and 5 bright white cylinders of light were projecting from the object into the water, and the water was spewing up into the air. It was near the shore, but every time the police arrived, it turned itself off when the headlights approached. Now, there was a lot more meetings during January, but not quite so much. Now, I received a call from the local police chief and the newspaper editor up there, and we said, well, okay, we'll come up and investigate, and we'll set a Saturday afternoon at the sailing club for witnesses to come forward and tell us what they saw. And we were amazed. The sailing club was packed with people. Not the 5 or 10 we expected. Now, it wasn't just all the people that had witnessed this event on the night of the 30th of December. There was a lot of much older people in their 70s and 80s that said, I saw something all these years ago. Nobody believed me. The family told me to shut up, but I'm going to tell somebody before I die.
Really?
Now, these were very believable people.
Wow.
So instead of just getting a whole lot of information about the one particular night, we got a massive information from the inhabitants of the Central Coast about what they'd witnessed and experienced in the past, which sort of it ended up in us writing the book, The Gosford Files. But there was, although most of the sightings and experiences on that night were benign, one lady came to me, she was fairly old. That same night of the 30th December, she lived in Berkeley Vale, and her daughter and grandson, Rory, were staying the night, and they sent Rory in the early evening up to the shops to buy some beer and provisions for a New Year's Eve party the next night. The thing is, Rory didn't come back. And then there was a knock on the door late at night, and the police had Rory between them, very disorientated and confused. And after he got in, he said, Granny, he said, I was walking through the park, he said, and these little creatures jumped out of the bushes and grabbed me, and I don't remember anything else. Now, it was some hours later that his body was in the park, and the public called the police and said, we think somebody's been done in the park. Actually, Rory was only unconscious. His wallet was intact. The beer carton had not been opened. Yeah, he wasn't drunk. He hadn't been robbed, and he whispered to Granny, he said, about these little beings that had taken him from the park, but he said, Mum doesn't believe me. Now, during the night, there was the same buzzing noise that people had heard on the other sightings, and the house was vibrating. The next thing, his mother said at about 5 or 6 in the morning, we're going, we're leaving, you've got a wasp nest in the house. But Granny thought that she was suddenly scared, believed Rory, and was frightened they were coming back for him. But of these witnesses that all came forward as a result of that night, we found quite a few that had implants in them. Some of the women with damage to their reproductive organs, stuff like that. And I did learn a very hard lesson. One of the girls had an implant in her leg which she managed to work out. And a colleague said to me, I've got a friend in America that will analyse this implant. Now, once he got the implant, he broke off all contact with us. And would you believe, a week later, he got a very good government contract.
Really?
So that made me realise I have to be careful who I trust and what I give to. But 3 months later, on the 16th of March 1996, 500 miles to the north on the coast at Casino, a couple I'll call Stan and Wanda Langer, which is actually their pseudonym, had an experience while they were driving along the road.
Are we still in Gosford?
When they got home.
Is this still the Gosford area, Moira?
It's 500 miles to the north. This is the interesting thing.
Okay.
But on the same coastline, 75 minutes later, they got home and they were late. Later, hypnotherapy did sort of divulge an abduction of different-looking aliens, some 7 foot tall, some smaller, with medical examinations. And then it appeared again with this hereditary thing that Stan had previous contacts during his childhood. And there was another very sad case from behind Gosford past Carryong, in February 97, just over a year later. There was a lovely lady called Vicky who had been in New Guinea, and she told me there were sightings there. And whenever a UFO appeared, the natives would run up to the mission saying, bad spirits, bad spirits. And she lived in a valley, quite remote in a way, and at 1:30 on a Saturday morning, her kids had come home and were playing rock music. She went outside to just get a bit of break of peace and have a cigarette, and she suddenly saw this ball of golden light, and it came racing out of the sky and lodged in the top of a tree. It was quite big. It was a white oval with the exterior rotating clockwise and a red core rotating anti-clockwise. It suddenly shook itself free from a tree and fell in the valley below. A couple of days later, she went up the track with the dogs, and there was a 20-foot wide, foul-smelling column of mist. The dogs refused to go through it, but she did walk through it, and she immediately became very nauseated. Now, she called us a few weeks later. We went up to the area where the object had come down.
Yes.
We could see all the trees where it had been. They weren't burnt. It was just like they were totally baked from all moisture.
Wait, so you saw this yourself, that the trees were essentially dehydrated, dried out?
I got photographs of it. So we took radiation measurements with a Geiger counter and were surprised that the area where it had come down had less radiation than the outside control area, which was unusual.
Interesting.
I actually sent her husband and a male colleague down into the valley to see if they could see any wreckage. And they appeared about 2 minutes later. And these big brave men said to me, "We're not going down there. There's a big snake in the tree." And I certainly couldn't climb down there. But she was telling me then about how that was an old road that had been made by the convicts many years before, and she could sense ghosts and stuff like that around, which didn't really disturb her. But in the bottom of the valley, there was a ranch, which was supposed to be a horse riding ranch, but she felt that it was something a little more sinister than that, because they had goats' heads on the wall, and she never saw anyone riding, and there was quite a few VIPs that used to go there. And she sort of said to me, "Did they manifest this?" The sad part about the whole thing is less than 12 months later, she and her husband were driving home. She keeled over in the passenger seat and was dead within about an hour.
What was it, like a heart attack?
She was only in her 40s. So there was something that made me very uneasy about that whole scenario at that stage. And then later, in October 97, I was approached at a seminar by a very hippie-looking bloke who was totally beside himself in an awful state. And he said that he lived on the estuary to the Hawkesbury River, which forms the boundary of Gosford. And he was a cartoonist, a very good cartoonist. And he went out to the side of the river at about 2:30 in the morning to clear his head. Now, this was very interesting because it was slightly different to the initial status sightings of the object earlier on. He said he could see a white light under the water about 100 foot from the beach, and it was circling round and round, and it was spraying water about 25 foot into the air. So he watched it, a little bit scared, for 20 minutes, and he said suddenly it circled out of the water, and then with this object giving off this very bright light, it was a cylindrical object, it was buzzing, and he looked up, and there was a hull of a huge global metal craft above. The outer rim was turning, and this little white, very bright object circled round and went up into the centre of what he called the mothership, and then with a whoosh, the whole thing disappeared. So this was another object in the same area that was slightly different behaviour. And later on...
I want to understand, Moira, so this was at the coast, or was this a water-based sighting? And forgive me if I missed this part.
Yes,
It's
the estuary of the river which forms the southern border of Gosford.
We're just about at the end of this segment.
It's between Sydney and Gosford. It's sort of the line between Sydney and the central
These
coast.
You've found a lot of these water-based sightings. You found quite a few of these, it seems.
Yes, I have.
Quite a few.
The interesting thing is that with the initial spate of sightings, some people thought that the white beams of light were pretty solid and just penetrating the water. Other people thought they were sucking water up. But I think it was a solid beams of white light which were causing the water to spray up.
Okay.
So later on, one of the TV channels did a documentary, part of which was on the Gosford sightings. There was a lot of pressure on the police not to say anything, but the police chief was very brave and went on this documentary called Oz Encounters and actually confirmed about the events of the 30th of December 1995.
Quite fascinating, Moira. We're at the top of the hour. I just want people to know, so I have your website in front of me, and so Moira McGhee has been, I think you've been running the Independent Network of UFO Researchers. That's INUFOR. And you can, this has got all of your books listed on here. It is independentuforesearchers.com.au.
Independent Net.
Yes.
Net.
Independent Net. UFO
Researchers.com.
.au. So
it can be either, both those sites.
So your books are listed here, and people are able to contact you at this site as well. They can PO box you or email you, and
I also have a Facebook page, Facebook/INUFOR, INUFOR.
And people can find you. Your name is Moira, Moira McGhee, McGhee.
That's correct.
Love hearing what you research.
But
And
they can go onto the Facebook page, but I only accept friends on Facebook if I know something about the people, naturally.
Yes, smart idea, actually. All right, well, look, we're at the top of the hour. I'm Richard Dolan here with the great Moira McGhee, one of the premier Australian UFO researchers, and she will be back with more of her personal research into the UFO subject when we return. We'll be right back. We're back. I'm here with Moira McGhee of the... Moira is involved with a number of UFO organizations. One is Bufora, that is the British UFO Research Association. Ufora.
That has closed down now.
I was wondering whatever happened to them. Ufora, and you have one...
They closed down, but I was with them for 25 years, yes.
Yeah, they were quite active for a long time. There's one, ACUFOS. I'm not sure what that one stands for.
ACUFOS, the Australian Centre of UFO Studies, which again has become defunct due to the Martin Gottschall, a wonderful researcher. He passed away, so it sort of didn't exist anymore.
But you were or have been a MUFON field investigator in New South Wales. In fact, you were the state director for MUFON New South Wales for 18 years.
Yes.
And you are a co-founder of the UFOR, this UFO Research, I assume, New South Wales.
Yes, correct.
That's the organization, I think, that invited me over.
Yes, that's right.
To speak, yes. A wonderful, wonderful organization of people, I must say. And then you coordinate, as we were just saying, the International UFO Organization. What is this called?
Independent Network.
Independent Network.
Yes.
Forgive me. I've got it in front of me.
In the mid-80s. Yeah. There were quite a few ship fights going on in ufology at the time, so I founded the Independent Network. Trying to stay out of the arguments.
That's excellent. So I am really itching to hear you talk about some of these cases of, or I guess more of these cases of human-looking non-humans or human-looking aliens or whatever they are. I think in some of your writings you express the idea that they are genetically related to us in one way or another. And I'll just point out to you, I did an interview recently with Dr. Joseph Farrell, who's very well known for doing a lot of research into Nazi technology and its relationship to the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah, very interesting area.
Oh, he's fascinating, but it's his opinion also, actually. It was surprising to hear this from him, that he believes that some of these beings may very well be our genetic cousins. I think that was the word he used. So I'd be interested.
That's the word Rosemary Decker used as well. Genetically, they're our cousins.
Yeah. Yes. But I'm curious if you are interested in discussing some of the research you have personally done on some of these human-looking beings, and what can we learn about them?
Well, I haven't got the answers, except that there are many, many, many cases through the years of these human-looking aliens, ones that have told us that they are actually alien, and that they hear from elsewhere. Mm-hmm. I've investigated also cases where some of the aliens involved have been human-looking, some haven't, where it has affected whole generations of families. Now, that takes at least 10 years to research each case, because you have to get to know granny, the parents, the children, and sometimes the grandchildren as great-grandchildren as well. But there were some interesting ones of blonde-haired, human-looking aliens that can suddenly just disappear into thin air. Now, there was a family, I spoke to a lady called Jackie Hayes, and they lived in Grafton, which is in northern New South Wales, near the coast, in 1982. And the father used to talk about a tall, blonde-haired couple who had strange powers. They could sort of tell him things. They once told him where some missing horses were. Now, it was very interesting, some of the similarities between cases where people and families never knew each other. And he'd once gone missing for 3 weeks, but he believed it was only one. He admitted to experiences during his life, and what it is, when I was discussing this particular case with her, it turned out Jackie herself had an implant, and these events and experiences affected her son and other relatives. But it was interesting about the tall, blonde-haired couple who were very beautiful looking and their strange powers.
And I just want to jump in. I just want to emphasize, you were saying that in these cases, people were missing for an extended period of time, but only thought it was like a few days or a much shorter period of time.
Yes,
so this
yes,
is...
I've got several cases like this, and they are very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so go on.
Again, in Bunyip, a place in northern Victoria, in the 1960s, locals saw an identical-looking, attractive blonde man and woman who would disappear into thin air. And this had them totally puzzled. They'd come into the shop, and a second later, when the witnesses turned around, they were just gone, disappeared. And nearby, there was a Cook family, and Casey Cook told me a lot about this, but then I spoke to other members of the family. They had a nearby property, and there was always strange phenomena in the house, UFO sightings quite often. Now, the father also went missing, once for 3 weeks, and he thought it was only a few days.
Yeah.
He had no memory of what happened. There was a very funny incident, one of many, on the property. He had an illicit still hidden in the trees down the back of the property. And one time there was a green oval UFO with high-pitched humming. They'd seen that more than once. The father thought that they had been raiding the alcohol out of his illicit still. That gives rise to some speculations. And he actually chased the object as it moved overhead in his little old VW, speeding down the track, waving his fist at it.
But wait, what did this object look like that he's chasing?
It was glowing green and oval, but there were other cases that I've documented in Contact Down Under.
And he's thinking that they're stealing
of strange events over the over this particular farm, with these green objects hovering overhead, the cattle going totally berserk, the older sister beside herself and terrified. And some of the experiences have continued on throughout their lives.
Okay.
And there was another third case, and this was interesting, that I'm investigating at the moment, where the one member of the family, an elderly gentleman now, he was working in a roadhouse. He has no memory. He was missing for 3 weeks and then walked back into the roadhouse, not even knowing he'd been gone for 3 weeks.
Now, what was his story?
And all he remembers was a strange couple walking into the shop.
Was this another blonde couple, or were they different?
He's not sure. He thinks they were something more akin to the Men in Black.
Not all of these humanoids are blonde, by the way. Some are...
No, there are some scruffy-looking ones. They are still mostly brown hair, though. An interesting one was, I've documented in Alien Gene, a witness called Charles who migrated to Australia from the UK. He had previous UFO experiences. In 1994, when he was living in Sydney, he met a blonde, blue-eyed Caucasian, about 35, and the gentleman called himself Michael, and he'd been in a spiritual retreat up where I live near in Katoomba, and when he sat on the rocks and played the guitar, a UFO appeared. Now, Charles invited him to stay with him in Sydney for a month, and one night he took him and his flatmate Paula outside, and all of he said, "Now just watch." All of a sudden, a UFO about 25 foot round rippled into being. And Michael said that he was able to communicate with these so-called multidimensional beings, and he could communicate telepathically with... Charles communicated telepathically with the craft. Michael said that he was originally from London, had also been in contact with the Hopi Indians in Canada with messages from the ETs. Now, what made this very strange, a naval acquaintance of Charles was very unhappy that Michael was there, and he said the Navy and security had been investigating Michael, who was ordered to leave and stop interfering with our planet and governments.
May I ask you a question? That's fascinating, by the way. These cases of people being able to, at least allegedly being able to just call in these UFOs. I mean, we hear about this all the time. And to be perfectly honest with you, I never really know what I think about them. It's
Well,
undeniable that there are
I
some
haven't
people who are.
investigated that many cases of this to be really sure about it.
Yeah.
But I have had some witnesses who've had multiple abductions going out, and this is in different countries, going out into the back garden, seeing the blue light and the wind that comes up with it, and just saying, oh, no, please, not tonight, I don't
Yeah.
feel like it, and the light's gone away.
Well, this
So
is
there
what I
must be
was.
some kind of telepathic communication there as well.
Yes, I'm reluctantly concluding these days that there are some people who just seem to be dialed into this because it does happen, and I've met a number of them myself, and some of them they're just as regular people can be. To be perfectly honest with you, and
Yes.
yet they have there's something uncanny about some of them where this phenomenon seems to follow them around, or they know when it's going to happen, or in a few cases they at least they claim to be able to call them in. And again, I have a certain skepticism about a lot of these people, at least in theory. But the stories keep coming, and I just wondered what you thought about it. So you've encountered these stories as well, it seems.
Yes, I have, but I think, and I'm going way out in a scientific area I'm not familiar with, but we look at quantum physics and then quantum biology and then quantum neurology. And what struck me, what led me on the path of investigating these witnesses where the whole family have had experiences, and they're very sane, sensible people, is that twins, if you have twins, something can happen to one in London, and on the other side of the world in Australia, they immediately know, or even experience similar feelings or pain that their twin is. And that led me to realise that somehow or other there is some advanced technology or knowledge which enables the communication between minds.
That's a really interesting insight. Because we do hear about this sort of thing, and I actually have no problem believing this at all, that twins and other close siblings and family members do have this type of connection. I mean, you hear about it frequently. So that would indicate that there's some kind of... you mentioned, you had the phrase quantum neurology. I'd never heard that before.
I have heard it said occasionally.
Yeah,
but remember one thing... technology or knowledge can be used for good or bad. And there would be agencies on this earth that would really love to be able to control people's minds or their thinking.
Yes. No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's sadly and frighteningly something that we will have to think about much more as the years go by, because the capabilities not only are there, but it will be possible, I would imagine, to scale them. In other words, to implement them on a very, very widespread capability, if we're not too careful about that. Can I ask you to comment on any more of these other cases of human-looking aliens that you have
Well, I was
researched?
looking at just a couple of cases of the scruffy-looking ones.
Oh,
Not
please,
the
yeah.
beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed ones that look perfect like angels, but the scruffy ones like Michael was. And in Alien Gene, I've got a very long section about a lady called Lisa and her family. Now, Lisa herself... she has got an implant which hasn't been taken out. They've seen it on X-rays. Her whole family's affected. But in 2000, it was when the doctor discovered the implant, and there was some talk about whether or not they would take it out. She decided not to. 4 days after that, being of a similar scruffy description, followed her around Vanara in the South Coast shopping centre using telepathic communication. And she instantly recognised him as not one of us and remembered him from a previous contact. She had a couple of abduction experiences. Okay. And she kept trying to avoid him as he followed around the shopping centre. And he reminded her that why was she trying to avoid him? He told her in the past that they promised to contact her again. She was a little bit worried that she showed interest in her own children because of the generational aspect of that, although she has some very intelligent children. But after he communicated with her, he again just seemed to disappear into thin air.
Wow.
He was in the aisle of the supermarket one minute and then just gone, not
Wow.
there at all.
And again, we hear of these people, these beings. They just seem to be completely integrated into human society. It's very different from the
Yes.
theories of people like David Jacobs, who talks about the hybrids, or the late Bud Hopkins, who talked about this, and they had their
They're
own
another
stories.
aspect of it, though. They are another aspect. I was just concentrating on one aspect.
Right, but with them, you can get this formulation of these hybrids that really don't have any social skills, and they are like learning, the ways of our civilization, the ways of humanity. But with these cases that you're finding, and actually other people have been finding, some of these beings, they seem completely, fully integrated, easily integrated into our society, with one advantage, which is that they seem to be completely telepathic.
Yes.
And maybe with the ability to influence us as well. But I'm not sure if you've gotten into that aspect with your research.
Yes, I have. And
Yeah.
that's a long study in itself, actually.
Mm.
But they do seem to have the ability to manipulate people's minds and thinking. Originally, there was an interesting case of I started to wonder why a gentleman called Roy Wallace and his wife Lorna. Now, Roy was a scientist, and he, in the 1960s, he'd been doing, as a young biologist, he'd been conducting some surveys at a place called Wauchope in the country, New South Wales. He was in a car with two other colleagues, and they were coming back down to the town to get dinner. And at about 8:30, as they were going down a winding dirt road, a bright light sort of came up fast behind them. Now, they thought at the time that it was a car trying to pass, so they pulled over to the side of the road and became a bit confused after that. And they looked out and the light was gone. And they thought, oh, maybe someone's broken down. They went back up the track, but no sign of a car. When they got down the hill to the town to get dinner, it was then 4:30 in the morning.
Oh, boy.
They had missed about 8 hours. Now, the whole thing is the person who approached me over this research investigation was actually his wife, Lorna, who is a psychologist. And she said, my husband's not mad, he's a brilliant scientist. And then it turned out that he'd had this compulsive mission to collect books, especially technical books. And he'd filled 2 warehouses with his books. And he had this compulsion, along with another friend, Peter Roach, another scientist, to collect all these technical books, and then they had to move them inland away from the coast and bury them 600 metres above sea level minimum.
Wait.
Rather...
He collected, after this encounter, he had a compulsion to collect technical books. I'd like to ask in a moment what the subject, what the field was.
All subjects, at least as if he was collecting the sum of our knowledge.
Okay, wow. Okay, so he's developing this massive scientific technical library, and then developed some kind of compulsion to leave the coast, to move inland, and did you say bury the books?
Bury them within a concrete bunker more than 600 metres above sea level.
What happened to this guy?
His friend, another scientist, Peter, was involved in this project, and Peter moved inland up the north coast, and then Roy and his wife moved inland as well, away from the coast. And the thing is that it's a bit difficult to explain, but his wife was very worried because she and her daughter had also sort of been stalked by UFOs hovering above them when they were driving down the country roads. She was quite frightened of what all this was about. A couple of friends who'd investigated UFOs, including one ufologist, Dr. Roy Lintner, that was pushed under a train in Rome, she thought they were getting into very dangerous territory. So the whole thing is that he'd been just collecting these books like he was absolutely compelled to do so. And the strange thing is, I was told by an acquaintance that she saw a male colleague, with a strange alien-type being up the road, and the being disappeared into thin air as if interdimensional. And when I spoke to this fellow, Kevin, he also alluded to UFO experiences and then mentioned Roy and the books, and he referred to him by his actual name, not the pseudonym I'd given him. So I thought, was he or the other gentleman in the car? I don't know. But it was also this compulsion to collect the sum of our knowledge and bury it safely that had me really sort of interested.
Well, it doesn't. It's almost like out of a movie script. I mean, Maura, do you remember in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Richard Dreyfuss has this compulsion to create what ends up, I think, being the Devil's Tower in the Western U.S. with mashed potatoes.
That has happened with compulsions like that, have happened with a great many of the witnesses and experiences that I've interviewed.
And this is
the interesting thing, I discuss it a little bit in Alien Gene and Contact Down Under. A lot of these contactees and experiences, without going into details, they have actual physical evidence, missing ovaries with no sign of an operation, implants that you can either get or there's x-rays of. But a lot of them had suffered these compulsions. It was as if their minds were being manipulated.
Deeply affected. And now this I want to just go back to this scientist who's collecting this library of human knowledge and then buries it in a concrete bunker. So you never spoke with him, but it sounds like you spoke with his wife.
Yes, I did.
You did?
Actually, I'm vice president of an animal rescue organisation, and we have a couple of what you'd call charity shops, so we sell a lot of books.
So what did
that's how I met them. What
did he tell you about this?
Looking for particular books, and that's how I got to meet his wife. And then they realised I was involved in these investigations, and the wife started talking to me first.
What was his explanation as to why he engaged in this behaviour?
He doesn't really know, but following that incident out west when they lost 8 hours, it was like a compulsion. 2 compulsions took over him. First of all, he said that he felt he had a mission in life. He didn't understand why, but it was a very all-pervasive mission in life to collect these books and these instructions that he wasn't sure where it came from, except the compulsion. And also his friend that was helping him. Mm-hmm. And then when I came across the third fellow and the reports of an interdimensional type being disappearing into thin air, it really had me interested. But his second compulsion was to move away from the coast.
Right.
He just could not live in Sydney anymore. He had to move out west, away from the coast. And this has been an ongoing theme, a recurring theme with a lot of these witnesses, especially the ones where it affects the whole generation.
Well, first of all, he has, I think, a very kind and understanding wife, so he's very lucky. But secondly...
But a very frightened one, considering she and the daughter have been stalked by UFOs as well.
Yes, indeed. So, well, if we've got only a couple of minutes before we have to have our next break, but I'm just curious if you have thoughts on what is behind these compulsions. Like, why would these individuals engage in these types of compulsive behaviors?
Yeah, well, maybe I should talk about that a little bit more at length after the break. But quite often when you're doing research, you'll get one case that you investigate, and then 10 years later, somebody else comes along that actually gives you contributing, sort of confirming evidence to the previous one. It's something that... You can't really stand up on a soapbox and say, anyone that's had a UFO experience, please come and see me, because you have to keep some kind of sort of genuineness about the whole research. And it's been bit by bit over the years that I've suddenly started putting some pieces of the jigsaw together, especially to do with the compulsions that are experienced, sometimes very strange compulsions. Dr. Carla Turner talked about this, that are experienced by the contactees and experiences as if something has manipulated their mind, or there is some kind of hidden knowledge somewhere within their brain which has been given to them and only comes to the fore at certain occasions.
That's interesting. It's interesting and unsettling at the same time.
Yes.
To recognize that we humans are not necessarily fully in control of our environment or indeed ourselves at all times, and I think that's one of the unsettling things about what comes up in research like yours and that of other people. These compulsions and I think it's the biggest. By the way, we're almost right at the end here of this segment, but I'll just say it's probably one of the big resistance points that we get from the world of science and the academic world, which my take anyway is that they really are working under this assumption that we are running the show. We human beings, we're at the top of the intellectual food chain, as it were, and there's not another intelligence that's operating here that has capabilities far beyond our own. But I think the longer we investigate this UFO phenomenon, those of us who really delve into it, we see that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. There is another intelligence or intelligences that are operating in ways well beyond what we do, what we operate in, and they do have the ability to manipulate and control when they wish. That's the unsettling thing. So,
actually, I studied law at university, and I'm waiting for a court case where the defendant turns around and says to the judge, "The aliens made me do it, Your Honour. The aliens made me do it."
Oh my! Well, that'll be a frightening day when if there's ever a true disclosure of this, and that may be a legal defense for all we know, right? I want people to know your website. Again, I'm just going to mention it. Moira McGhee you can find her at Independent Net UFO Researchers, with an S there, .com.au. That's Independent Net UFO Researchers.com.au. And this has
Facebook/InUFO for the page.
Yeah, Facebook also. And her books are The Gosford Files, Contact Down Under, and Alien Gene, which is I'm holding in my hand here. So they're all great books.
Actually, I have just written a novel called Incognito, my very first novel.
Yeah, actually, and Tracy and I looked it over when we were in Sydney. I think I said to you, it's a really cool novel. It's well, maybe we can talk about that when we come back. We're at the end of this segment. I'm Richard Dolan here with Moira McGhee on KGRA Radio. We'll be right back. We're back. I'm Richard Dolan here with Moira McGhee. Moira, can you believe the time has flown by? We're in our final segment.
There's so many cases. I mean, the two books are really the culmination of about over 30 years of research, and I didn't want to write a whole book on one case and just waffle on. I thought, let's just get the information out there.
I think listeners are understanding why. Like when I've been to Sydney twice now, the other Sydney UFO researchers and people, everyone says the same thing. It's like, you must speak with Moira, and this is why. You are a wealth of information. You have been researching this subject. On the back of your book, it says 40 years. Is that that sounds about right for you?
That sounds about right, but it's revealing my age to a certain extent.
Well, I'm only reporting public information. But my point is that you have been delving into this for a long time, and you are incredibly experienced. You've met an enormous number of people in this field and have learned more than the vast majority of researchers out there, I think.
But I'm still learning, and I still don't have the answers. And any UFO researcher who tells me they have their answers, I think you're kidding yourself. We don't know the answers. We can speculate. We can see quite a bit of evidence. But any alien, whether they look like us or different to us, you can't trust them on face value that they are what they say they are. There could be a lot of deception involved, and who we think are the goodies could be the baddies, and vice versa. We just don't know.
Yeah, I agree. We have to be cautious in forming judgments, particularly when we're talking about the nature of these other beings. I'm much more comfortable talking about the phenomenon itself. It's measurable, it's observable.
Yes.
We can argue it in a public domain. When we get into the speculation of these other beings, it's a more shaky ground. On the other hand, all of us, when we're in this field long enough, we continually get these stories of encounters, and And I
Yes.
think we do want to know about them. So you wanted to talk a little more about the compulsive nature of the aftermath of these encounters. Did you have a few more things you wanted to say on that?
Yes, I do. Many of the witnesses have commented on their minds being and thinking being manipulated. Some that it's some kind of telepathic manipulation. Others, like if you compared our brain to a computer, like information's been put on the hard drive that from time to time suddenly comes down. They get sudden realizations or thoughts. But the most interesting thing is that in Alien Gene, the contactees, Patty, Lisa, Elizabeth, and many others, including the Aboriginal people of Australia, have been advised that there could be a future catastrophe. And it seems to be more like something of a natural disaster rather than a war, and that they have all felt urged or compelled to move to higher ground away from the coast and to become self-sufficient. This is an ongoing theme among all the different contactees that I've met.
How are these people getting these messages? Is this a telepathic
It's
thing?
not.
Is this a memory?
It's like something silent and unseen. They suddenly don't want to live in Sydney or on the coast anymore, to the extent they feel sick and traumatised and upset about being in the city or near the coast. And once they make the move into the country or away from the coast, they suddenly feel at peace. Many have become self-sufficient. Especially Patty's family. Lisa is still stuck near the coast and gets terrible nightmares and dreams. Many of them have moved away from the coast. I know Aboriginal people, some of whom who are contactees, that have said farewell to their home tribal lands and moved inland. And not only that, it's the self-sufficiency nature of it. Now, I myself was a counter-disaster administrator. I was a local controller in the State Emergency Service, and also it tried to impress on people the need to be self-sufficient. We have become to depend on technology so much. Now, whether that technology is of our own innovation or whether some of it has been given to us by the aliens, I'm not sure. But I point out that without the technology, we're sort of, to put it rather bluntly in Australian, up shit creek without a paddle. Some of the old trades are going out of fashion due to technology.
Oh, yes.
What happens in, say, another 20 or 30 years' time if due to a solar flare or some other event we lose our technology?
So
we have no internet, no phones, no electricity.
Oh, yeah.
Has anyone stopped to think we wouldn't be able to get food or petrol or water?
People have forgotten
communication?
all of those skills. Those are all gone. That's all gone. We have no ability to deal
Now,
independently.
these contactees and experiences are aware of this, and they've moved out. They've set up little farms. They're growing their own vegetables. They have chooks and goats and things like that. But I even found it difficult as an administrator to explain to the younger generation that everything they're depending on is not going to be there in a disaster. But modern society seems to keep going blithely on, thinking, oh, she'll be right, mate, she'll be right, Jack, and it won't be. And I think we have to preserve some of the skills that we have in case we need to start again in the event. I mean, what would happen, say, if a great big asteroid crashed into the Pacific? There'd be massive tidal waves. We've had prophets and seers like Edgar Cayce, who is a wonderful person, predicting these kinds of cataclysms. We now have, I think, probably more earthquakes and volcanoes happening in the world. You've got talk, some of the contactees believe in Planet X or Nibiru. Now, the astronomers do know that there is something out there because the Kuiper belt doesn't peter out, it's cut off dead. So there could
Really?
be
I didn't know this. I did not know this. The Kuiper belt just stops
You have a few
suddenly?
very brave astronomers talking about Planet X, and a lot of conspiracy theorists talking about Nibiru. Now, I don't think anything's going to happen, and I wouldn't want to start a public panic, but I do think the messages or the manipulation of their minds that these experiences are getting is telling them to learn to be self-sufficient, learn to be able to fend for themselves. But are retreats around the world that are supposedly set up by the aliens for some people to go. And it's an interesting aspect of the whole scenario in itself.
Well, I would just like to add here my own experiences talking with other abductees or people who've had close encounters. There is something about the nature of this experience that can, how do I put this, switch on part of someone's mind.
Yes.
And this may be part of what's going on here. There also could just be a philosophical realization at some deep level. I wonder when someone encounters an intelligence and a civilization that's operating on completely different principles than our own, I can imagine that it would prompt someone to do some hard reflection on the nature of what it is that we are doing. And I mean, I want you to continue this in a moment, but I just want to say, well, I did a book a number of years ago on the implications of disclosure and what would it be like if this secret were to become open and we were to talk about it. And one thing I've often wondered is how ordinary people would come to a philosophical position where they would just say, my God, there are these telepathic, incredibly intelligent extraterrestrials that are walking among us, and I've been spending my entire life watching football games or reality TV. Like, what I've been wasting my life. And I do suspect that would be one reaction that a lot of people might have. Like, they would have this idea that suddenly they've just been wasting their life. And I wonder that a little bit of this is happening to the experiencers that you're researching, that they're going into a deep place here relating to their experience and then making these fundamental life decisions as a result.
Yes, the other thing is that bothers me, the first rule always is thou shalt not panic the public, and I can understand where the government's coming from on that. Maybe disclosure could do more harm than good. The other thing is this incredible technology that we're developing. A, we're becoming too dependent on it, but B, as I point out in Alien Gene, what if extraterrestrials do not have our best interests at heart? The more we become dependent on technology, the more it can be taken over and used against us.
Absolutely.
And I really do doubt that if any intelligent extraterrestrial were visiting this planet and giving us technology, they wouldn't give us the entire amount. They would always leave the possibility of control in their own hands. And this is something where I think maybe the governments in their wisdom have decided disclosure might not be the best way to go.
Well, we see this not simply with extraterrestrials that might be running such technology, but our own governments through Facebook and social media and other forms of connectivity. You know, they can deplatform people that they deem to be outside their primary interest, and this is happening more and more. Restriction of content and the promotion of frivolous content, I think, really seems to be the trend of the future. So there's a lot of social control going on in this. Independent of any extraterrestrials, I think it could be them as well. So this is something that we have to be really careful about. I fully agree with you here.
Yes, well, of course, it was really interesting about the Roy Wallace case and collecting all the books as if they might be needed later in black and white, hard, solid print, rather than the tendency today to have everything on digital technology, which will be lost if all the systems go down.
Exactly. Absolutely. Well, I still have a nice physical library of paperback and hardcover books, and I intend to keep.
Yeah, it was very, very interesting. I don't know if we've got time for this. The observations, which were, there was an article written to a newspaper, and it was actually received 2 weeks before the Kevin Arnold case. And this was very, very interesting.
Oh, yes, please, let's talk about it. And actually, I think you said 2 months before Kenneth Arnold, so we're talking April 1947.
It was April 1947,
yes.
2 months before the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting, and 5 years before Adamski's meeting and messages. And it was an article called Son of the Sun. I don't know if you wanted to read it out or if we have time or I should,
I
whatever
have
you
it.
wish.
Yes, it's in the Alien Gene, and I've got it. I've got it open right here to page 253, where you've got.
Yes.
We can't. I don't think we can read this entire letter, but I'll just do a very quick description of it. This is your writing.
Yes.
You write here in April 1947, 2 months before the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting. An article called "Son of the Sun," so Sun S-O-N, of the Sun S-U-N, submitted under the pen name Alexander Blade, was received by Ray Palmer. And Ray Palmer, many people following this field might remember, he was the editor of, later he was the editor of Fate magazine. At this time he was the editor of Fantastic Adventures magazine. Palmer published it a few months later in November 1947, and it was been reprinted. So the first paragraph I'll just read. It says, "We are already here among you. Some of us have always been. We have been confused with the gods of many world religions, although we are not gods, but your fellow creatures, as you will learn directly before many more years have passed. You will find records of our presence in the mysterious symbols of ancient Egypt, where we made ourselves known. Our principal symbol appears in the religious art of your present civilization and occupies a position of importance upon the great seal of your country." I assume this is the United States. "It has been preserved in certain secret societies founded originally to keep alive the knowledge of our existence and our intentions toward mankind." There's quite a bit more. This is a long letter.
Yes.
But so really what we're talking about is a letter, presumably, from other beings who are living among us, who I presume would look like us, and they are, but they're not us. So what are they?
Yes. Yes.
So what do you think about this letter?
It was interesting what Plato wrote. Some of these generations, these families that have had experiences, also had a sudden compulsion to start researching ancient history, the history of the Sumerians, the Anunnaki, the Nephilim, Mayan history, ancient Indian cultures, American Indian cultures, and also Asian Indian cultures. They had this compulsion as well to delve into ancient history where it regarded gods and strange beings. So it's interesting.
It's funny.
No one knows who wrote that letter, that article.
No, it's fascinating. And just as an aside here, I have just lately been, for my own reasons, I didn't even know why, I've been obsessed with understanding human prehistory. From understanding it, I really want to know what is the academic consensus of human prehistory, that is prior to ancient Sumer, prior to writing, and to try to make sense out of that with some of the claims of the, can we fit in an ancient astronaut theory, ancient aliens theory, and so forth. But yeah, it's been an interest of mine just lately.
The problem is some of the sort of forward-thinking researchers and scientists find there's a lot of peer pressure for them not to say anything. You've also got the different religions and their power structure that don't want that interfered with or toppled with new ideas.
No, absolutely.
This does become a problem, yes.
Absolutely. No, that's an interesting letter. And yes, it was several months before the Kenneth Arnold sighting and whatever this was. Maybe it was just someone having fun, right? But it's very much along the lines.
It was well written.
Yes.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Do we have time to talk about what Penny Taylor said?
Yes, please. We've got about 10 minutes, so I think we can do it.
Okay. So hang on. Yes, what she said was very interesting. She was a very interesting experiencer who originally broke down due to the trauma of remembering what had happened, but later I have been in contact with her. But she hadn't been that well educated. Her father was an itinerant worker that moved across the country with different jobs, and then it resulted in an abduction. And some very interesting things came out of that one. But she wrote to me, While scientists search for life on other planets and pose questions of whether we're down here alone or not, the alien has encroached on mankind in a very obscure and non-intrusive way. This form of invasion cannot be fought by our military. We are not equipped to defend ourselves. Invasion and adaptation go hand in hand. Genetic engineering is very high on the alien agenda. We hear about abductees seeing hybrids and having eggs taken from them, not to mention their embryos being removed. It is ignorant on our part to assume that they need us or our DNA to survive, or for that matter, that they are the hybrids. Dipping into the human gene pool might give the alien the genetic makeup to adapt and multiply. In other words, you might say the alien has landed, genetically speaking. Who knows? Maybe the microscope and not the telescope will be the first to discover the alien in all his glory and wonder. It is not a few of us who are chosen. It is all mankind. This would account for the elusive and insidious behaviour by the so-called greys. Most people would laugh at such an idea, but it is human nature to laugh at what we fear, the truth.
So, yeah, let's unpack
came
that.
From a lady who had not had much formal education.
Yeah, some pretty interesting writing. The idea that we might be able to detect these other beings through genetic study. Is that the reason that you named this book The Alien Gene, by the way?
No, I named it The Alien Gene because in these families, they all seem to be from particular bloodlines, which made me wonder if a particular bloodline was more useful, more adaptable. And also, these people had implants, they had ovaries or eggs removed without any evidence of an operation. The children are exceptionally bright. They're almost to genius level. There was a lot of consistencies among these people, the telepathic communications, the experiences, and it was only later in the research that I started tracing their ancestry and realised that there was a lot of common denominators.
So there is something in your view that connects at least some of these experiencers, and there's can we assume then that there's maybe reason to think there's a genetic interest, if there's something about the bloodlines that makes these people interesting to these others?
Yes, I do.
What do you think it is? Do you have any ideas?
I don't know. I'm still researching that, Richard.
One thing I've wondered...
I'm still toying with ideas.
I'm going to toss out...
We don't understand a great deal about genes either. I mean, they used to consider 95% of our DNA was junk DNA, and they realised it's not. We know very little really about the human brain, the human genetic makeup. We are learning, we are investigating, but we don't have all the answers yet.
Well, I sometimes wonder, like, if I were a super intelligent telepathic ET observing humanity, I wouldn't necessarily be interested in everyone equally. I would be interested in certain people that would be of interest, right? And so what would those individuals be? And I would perhaps be more interested in those humans who might themselves have what we might call psychic ability or telepathic capability. I often hear anecdotally about people who've gone through meditation experiences or other types of spiritual practices or intellectual practices, then reporting some form of contact. And it just has made me wonder if this is a critical part of the process, and I'm going to take a wild guess and think that you will probably agree with that.
Yes, I think maybe some genes are more compatible for manipulation than others. I think the thing is too, really, we know that, most of us believe that we have a soul, but what is a soul? Researchers, scientists, religions are all still trying to investigate what is it that makes us human, what gives us our individuality, and what is it about the spiritual experiences. Now, some people just want to know for their own benefit to to get more spiritual knowledge and experience, but there's also the other side of the coin where certain agencies would like to know how all of this works on a scientific basis so they can manipulate it.
Well, we have about 4 or 5 minutes left, if you can believe it, Moira, and I realize
It's gone very quickly.
I realize you don't like to put yourself out there with a speculation, but I'm just wondering. There are all of these cases of these beings walking among us, looking like us, and so on. Do you have any idea, like what their goals may be? What are they doing among us? If you have any
Look, it's
ideas.
easy to say. It's easy to say that they've got our best interests at heart, but that's possibly a little naive. It could be that they have seen us get to a dangerous level with our technology, and that they're worried. I mean, we're that. If you look at the human race and the planet, it's not a very nice place. It's full of cruelty, injustice, and bigotry, greed. We are not a very nice race of people. Perhaps they're just worried that with our advancing technology, we're going to get out there in the galaxy and perhaps cause havoc.
It's not difficult to come to that conclusion, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we engage in constant warfare, in constant destruction of the world around us. We've got wonderful people, but there are elements of our infrastructure that I've often wondered, if you could have the most wonderful, good human beings who have ever lived placed in charge of the world's biggest corporations, and they wouldn't be able to turn the practices around because, the corporations would become less profitable, and they would just be taken right out of power, and because they have their own inexorable logic. The structure of corporate power on this planet has its own inevitability.
Well, I have speculated in Alien Gene that there could have been several Plan A's and Plan B's with the aliens. Perhaps the Plan A sort of was to just come here and have open contact, to try and get us to change our ways. Perhaps it was also to try and endeavour to get a one-world government that they could deal with. But a one-world government seems to be as far away as ever, though one wonders about the Nazis and some of the other major powers of whether they were attempting to have a one-world government. Then they sort of sent messengers over the centuries telling us to be nice, good people. But again, with the religious messengers, it was soon turned into religious power structures that were just as cruel as anybody else.
Oh, yes.
And then I thought maybe the final thing will be to microchip us all. And a lot of the corporations want us to have microchips. So what would happen if an alien race or intelligence were able to then take over the microchips and manipulate all of us into behaving better?
Oh, well, let me just say that...
But they're all theories, and I've got no proof and no conclusion.
It's a theory, but it's not an impossible theory. Every now and then, I will just say in my own research, I will stumble across a little lead here and there that makes me wonder, have they inserted themselves into our power structure, into our financial structure, into our economic structure? And it actually would be a very logical thing for them to do if they had the ability. And so you really do have to wonder. This rabbit hole can go very, very deep indeed. Incidentally, may I ask, we're just about out of time, but the scenario that you just put out there, the various Plan A, Plan B, is this related to the theme of the novel that you've written?
No, not really.
That's
It's a
different.
novel I've written incognito. I'm hoping that I might get a producer interested in it as a TV series. It's about aliens that are based on Earth and have integrated.
It is.
And they have a base on Earth hidden and bases in other parts of the solar system.
Yeah, you did
They're
kind of a
trying
nice
to lead
inside...
people to a better life, but the infiltrators themselves, the aliens that look like humans, are starting to get themselves into trouble and adopting some of more human tendencies, and the poor leader of the base is forever getting them out of trouble.
It's a very cool inside view, actually. And actually, we may be able to, stick around after this interview is done. We can chat about that for the Richard Dolan member side, if you don't mind. But we are...
Yes, for sure.
Oh, yeah, would love to. We are out of time, Moira McGhee. It's been absolutely wonderful.
We only got into a few of the experiences people have had,
Only a
actually.
few. Only a few, but it was actually quite fascinating. I just want people to know, once again, this is Moira McGhee of Australia. She has been running the independent network of UFO researchers for quite a long time. She's a very experienced UFO researcher. Her website, she's on Facebook, and you can look for her books directly at independentnetuforesearchers.com.au. We're going to have links below
And
for everyone who's interested.
on the Facebook/In4 page, I post quite often a lot of scientific or astronomical information besides UFO related, because I think people need to be educated about the solar system, the galaxy around us, and the cosmic side of things as well.
Fantastic. Well, Moira, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, and people out there, remember we in Australia are having just as many sightings and experiences that very few people ever hear about.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Moira.
Thank you.
And with that, it's time to say goodnight. Thanks for listening. If you want to hear some follow-up conversation between Moira and myself, you can go to richarddolanmembers.com, where she gives her thoughts on the nature of an extraterrestrial infrastructure here on Earth, a treatment she recently fictionalized in the form of a novel. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Good night. Thanks for listening to The Richard Dolan Show. You can join me live most Mondays at KGRA Radio, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. To learn more about what I'm up to, visit richarddolanmembers.com, where you can read my latest articles or listen to my off-the-cuff thoughts on pretty much anything. Also, don't forget richarddolanpress.com, where I publish books by myself and some of the most interesting authors of our time. Catch you later.